I like to start out by just sharing a little bit about my background and how I got to become engaged in this work. And I do so for a couple reasons, one of which comes from the early feminist movement, where women were getting together in small circles and they were sharing their stories. And when they did that, they actually figured out that their own individual experiences as women were not isolated experiences. That when they got together with other women from their communities, they began to see patterns that emerged, patterns around child rearing, their role as women in the workplace, and all those types of things. And so they coined a phrase that I like to say, it's called the personal is political. So what ways does our own lives and struggles mirror that which is happening in larger political and social infrastructure? And how can we examine what's going on with ourselves and look at larger patterns? And how can we make changes on an individual and community level that can similarly affect broader scale change? So that'll be a little bit of a theme in the class today. And I like to start out by saying I'm in recovery from the suburbs. I grew up right outside of Philadelphia in a town called Paoli. And Paoli was where the R5 train stopped right outside of Philadelphia. And my grandparents immigrated to this country from southern Italy. And my grandfather, when he was looking for a place to call home, really tried to find a place that was accessible to public transportation, that was by a school, that was close to a park. And so there it was. Paoli, Pennsylvania was the place that they decided to call home. And so my grandfather worked in this country doing manual labor for about 10 years, slowly saving up money to return to send for his wife and his 7 children that were still in Italy. And so I have an interesting kind of background in terms of my rootedness to this country. And on some level, we're all transplants, right? We all have these stories of our past heritage and what brought us to this country, unless we're a native to this country to begin with. And so mine's a little bit of a story of a southern Italy, where my grandparents, my father, and their whole community was more or less practicing permaculture design back then, but they didn't necessarily call it. It was just how they lived. They lived in a small farming village in the mountains of southern Italy and did things like farmed with draft animals. They grafted fig trees and collected chestnuts and stored them throughout the winter in buckets of sand. They didn't have electricity in their small village. And the idea was money was different than it is today. And so most people practice what we call now the barter economy, where many people there just had small plots of land where they were doing homesteading. They might have had a pig or some chickens and a cow, and they generated food to feed their own families and maybe a little bit to share or sell. And that was the way that the village operated. So flash forward to me coming out, maybe about 10 years later. I was born in 1977, and had really one foot rooted in this old traditional way of doing things. So growing up, we had Tomato Day in my family, where we'd go down to New Jersey and we'd pick bushels and bushels of tomatoes. And for 3 whole days, we'd make tomato sauce with all of my family. And so you can imagine, as middle schooler, that was kind of weird. And I couldn't really understand back then, why would we do this? Why would we go through all the effort of picking the tomatoes and then sit around for days canning them? And we end up with like 100 jars of tomato sauce by the end of it. And it was really questioning, why couldn't we be normal, right? And why couldn't we just fit in and go to the supermarket and buy ragu? They had a lot of those. We could get mushrooms, we could get herbs with onions. And so I share that story because it kind of mirrors this idea of assimilation, right? Where you're taking a group of people and they're trying to kind of fit into the current framework, current culture. And so I was really torn between those 2 experiences, growing up rooted in that tradition, that long-standing tradition of a culture that was based on Earth's natural cycles, that was deeply rooted in community and customs, and then also that world of the suburbs, where I was taking my life into my own hands by crossing the street to get to the supermarket. And so when I graduated from high school, I wanted to get as far away from the suburbs as possible. And for me, that was West Virginia University, where I went for a few different reasons. It was the #1 party school at the time. I had a great football team and excellent rock climbing and kayaking and hiking. So those 3 things combined led me to that school. And while I was there, you know, it's clearly I was going there to get a job. It was the story of immigration. I was going to live a better life than my family. Went to get a job. And while I was there, something else kind of happened. And I got really involved with an issue that probably most of you have heard about. Has anybody heard about mountaintop strip mining, mountaintop removal? So I was in school there in the late 90s and got really involved with the Student Sierra Club. Got really involved with the environmental movement in West Virginia. If you can imagine West Virginia environmental movement, you know, it's pretty small back then. You kind of knew everybody that was in the scene. And we met up with a guy named Larry Gibson. Larry Gibson is a man, he was probably about that tall, very outspoken, and he and his family had grown up in the hollers of southern West Virginia for generations. So much so that we took a trip down to southern West Virginia and got to see a burial site where several generations of his family were buried. They had their own family burial site at his homestead in West Virginia. And when we were there, he invited us out and we walked to the edge of his property. And standing there at the edge of the property and really looking around for about 180 degrees, all we could see was a strip mine site. And the closest thing that I can tell you to what it looked like was, if you can imagine the moon, it looked like a moonscape. So when we looked out for miles and miles and miles, what was formerly thriving farms and communities and schools and churches and forests and all of that was now a moonscape where there was nothing growing at all. And I try to do my best at conveying the scale at which this is happening. And one of the ways when I was working on the campaign down there, we said, is if you can imagine a drag line. How many of you know what a drag line is? Anybody out there? So a drag line is a new kind of mining tool that they're using, the mining company, where instead of having a lot of workers in the mines, they've switched over to high-powered machinery. So we could, when we were standing on the edge of the property, we could make out the drag line, this machine in the distance. And that was the machine that after they blasted off the tops of the mountains and filled in the valleys, it would go in and scoop the coal out. So if you can imagine, the scooper was the size of 23 compact cars. 23 cars for the scooper. It's a large machine. And when you think about this room for a second, you know, you can imagine how many cars do you think we could fit in here? 23? Okay, 23, great. So it's maybe about the size of this room, and a large scooper. And I say that to just bring to our attention that a lot of the resource use that our current economic system is engaged in is behind closed doors, right? We don't actually have to see that. And I was gifted with the experience of actually stepping behind the curtain and getting to see just one mountaintop site. This is one mountaintop site in West Virginia, you know, among hundreds of mountaintop sites, and it was enormous. So what I really kind of drew me into permaculture was this way in which it makes invisible systems visible again. So suddenly, when we're engaged in permaculture design, when we turn on the lights, we can actually have a direct link to how is that electricity produced? What are the social conditions, the workers, how are they treated? What are the ecological conditions and inputs and outputs from that system? And it really allows us to take responsibility for that. And so it's making, you know, all of a sudden we switch on the light and we know that that's actually coming from our solar PV array that's on the roof. And the solar PV array is also providing shade behind it for a little outdoor classroom. And in the outdoor classroom is surrounded by a food forest. Any of the roof runoff is going to feed those plants. So we can suddenly start to kind of link these systems together, and really allows us to take responsibility for our own actions and for the generations to come. So that's a little bit about kind of who I am and the background of where I'm coming from today. I wanted to share with you some of my latest thinking around David Holmgren's 4 scenarios. So we'll step back and we'll take a look at this graph. So this is coming out of David's book, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which he wrote in 2005. And David Holmgren was the co-originator of permaculture. So we oftentimes think of Bill Mollison, right? The Crocodile Dundee cigar smoking, flip-flop wearing, whiskey drinking guy. While his counterpart was David Holmgren, who was a much more studious, quiet type. And when David Holmgren and Bill kind of hooked up, it was David Holmgren's thesis. It was actually, permaculture was born out of the academy. And so it was David Holmgren's thesis that began to be Permaculture 1, one of the first books about permaculture design. So in 2005, he wrote a book called Principles of Pathways, which actually looked at social permaculture. We'll talk about that today, is what are those invisible systems? And so he draws out, kind of places us historically in time. Where is our generation? And on one level, he draws a simple bell curve. And we're looking at, on one side, population, pollution, and energy use. And then at the bottom, we're looking at time. So he starts it out at 10,000 years ago. Why start there? What was happening 10,000 years ago? Why does it start? Agriculture. Yeah, so it's the advent of agriculture. We're stopping hunting and gathering, and we're starting in permanent settlements. And so we can look, for a while, we've got pretty steady rates of population, pollution, and energy use. But then in the 1800s, we see a little bit of a skyrocket. So what was going on then? What made it change? Yeah, so we're looking at the Industrial Revolution. And we're looking at things like higher energy use, greater populations, greater pollution. And so what David is saying is actually our generation, where are we now? You can see that it's just been infinite growth up to this point, up to the top of the curve. And some of you have probably heard of the concept of peak oil. People familiar with that? And so what David's saying in this curve is that we've actually hit a peak with a lot of things. We can put peak oil up there, right? So peak oil is the idea that it's actually getting more expensive and more energy intensive to mine the rest of the oil than the energy taken that we use it. So it's taking us more energy to get it out than it's actually providing us. And so peak oil is one thing that we're getting to the peak of. What else is going on? Any other things we've hit the peak of? Peak fishing, yeah. I think it was 1984 that we hit peak fishing. Anything else?
Water.
Yeah, water. Yeah, and if we're thinking about some of our social systems, this is made popular by the Occupy movement, we're actually looking at the greatest disparity of wealth since the Great Depression. If you imagine the Great Depression disparity between the rich and poor, we've actually hit that, and we've gone past that. And so we can look at the concentrations of wealth also as being at that, one of those peaks. So we could brainstorm more lists at the top of that, but that's enough to kind of get the idea across. And what David's saying is, okay, great, we're on that peak. It's almost like we're standing at the Southern West Virginia homestead and looking over it. We're at a peak. Change is happening. And so which way is change going to go? So then he gets into some of his 4 scenarios. And so the first one he talks about, techno-fantasy, is the idea that don't worry about planet Earth, right? We've discovered water on the moon. We're just going to take a big spaceship and blast off to that other planet, or to the moonscape. Or it's, climate change, no worries. We've got these giant satellites that we're going to put in from outer space, and we're going to reflect it down. We're going to bury the carbon underneath the ocean, right? So these are actual scenarios that people are exploring. So the idea is, don't worry about it. Technology will save us, ultimately. We don't need to change anything. There's another scenario that he calls green tech. So with green tech, that's where I'd put most of the modern day sustainability movement. So it's not really questioning questioning our behavior patterns. It's just saying, let's buy energy efficient light bulbs and screw those in. Let's buy carbon offsets every time we fly or drive a Prius, right? So it's not fundamentally changing anything on this axis. So we're just kind of, let's ride this out. And I often joke with people, say you were married and somebody asked you, how's your marriage going? And you said, oh, it's sustainable. You kind of feel bad for the person. So it's kind of questioning, what is this idea of sustainability anyway? And one thing, in the next scenario, he calls energy descent culture. And that's where he places permaculture design. He's saying, how can we actually use the remaining fossil fuels and energy and all the intelligence that we've gathered to set up infrastructure that doesn't need to pollute and doesn't need to expend so much energy. So how can we set up systems, whether that's public rail, whether that's swales catching water off of contour, any of these numbers of permaculture solutions that we're engaging with. But ultimately, the larger goal is, how do we set up a system that doesn't need this much energy and that actually promotes people's health? It gets into the little bit of the definition of permaculture that I like to use, is how can we meet human needs? So our human needs of food, energy, housing, community, health and well-being, whatever those needs are, how do we actually meet those needs and actually increase the health of the ecosystem? So it's a totally radical idea, right? It goes counter to a lot of the systems, almost all systems that are set up right now. So how do we actually provide cleaner water? How can we actually use water and then make it cleaner than when it went in from the first place? How do we actually, in any action that we do, create healthier soil, healthier people, more equity? So that's the bold definition of permaculture, is we can actually do that. We can actually engage in our human needs, but actually increase the health of the ecosystem. And one of the important things to remember about that is there's a teacher of mine, Penny Livingston, where she took the permaculture principle that said work with nature. You've probably heard that principle, work with nature. So in permaculture design, we're actually looking at ecosystems and modeling them and working with them instead of fighting against them, right? So we're planting our forest gardens that mimic the forest ecosystem and tweaking them slightly instead of constantly mowing and mowing and mowing and using energy to get rid of grass. And so what Penny said is when we're looking at that principle, work with nature, we're still holding that humans and natural systems are apart from one another. And so she reframed that principle, then said that how are humans nature working? We are nature working. And so that's a fundamental kind of paradigm shift when we're talking about permaculture design, that it's actually saying nature's not something that's out there that I have to go to. Nature's actually within me. I am nature working at the same time. And one of the cool things I like to do when thinking about that, if you take your hand and then flip your hand around and look at your palm and just spend a second kind of looking at some of the patterns that are actually embedded in your palm. And then think about something in nature that you've seen that mimics that. Does anything come to mind? What does those lines remind you of? Tree branch, rivers. Yeah, even a leaf of a tree, if you looked at the underside of a leaf. You know, we could spend a whole class just kind of geeking out about that. Okay, we'll do this one. So if you take that same hand, make a fist, and then turn it over. And what's that? Snail shell. Yeah, sunflower, perhaps. It's the Fibonacci sequence, right? So 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 1 is 3, and so on and so forth. So it's the rate of growth. So we actually have these same patterns in our lungs, in our brains, that we actually see mimicked out in these natural systems. So Penny's saying, wait a minute, let's fundamentally change that. And that's huge. We're talking about a whole foundation of ideology that's built on the fact that humans and natures are separate, right? Nature is something that we need to exploit or conquer, or nature is something that's pure that we need to protect. So it's a radical rethinking of just our role as human beings. And so permaculture design is saying, how can humans actually be great healers of the ecosystem around us? How can we recognize our role as a keystone species and bring about healthier systems? So when I look at this curve, I kind of get depressed. I'm like, oh man, we're falling off of this peak. What a bummer, right? We've hit this peak. So what I actually like to do is just take that whole curve and flip it upside down. So how are we actually, here's my monster of the pit of despair, I like to call it. How is permaculture actually a way, kind of a ladder out of this pit of despair? And so when we're practicing permaculture design, we're creating regenerative systems. And so we're climbing out of this pit where we could see happiness indicators. Anybody know where the US rates in terms of happiness? It's actually, it's 14th, so we're not too bad. But like, if you consider that we're the richest country in the world, rating 14th is pretty bad. So how is permaculture a way to kind of climb out of that? Great. So thinking again about this, David Holmgren recently wrote an article that I recommend, and he's done a couple radio interviews called Crash on Demand. And so it's his latest thinking about these 4 scenarios. And David said, well, I just thought that permaculture would just kind of happen, right? That once people realized that we were spending more energy getting the fossil fuels out than it was producing, they just figure out that this isn't the way to go. Well, guess what? It hasn't happened. Even now we're doing things like tar sands, right? We're trying to squeeze the sand for any last drops of oil we can do. So our economic system, and this is what he didn't really realize, has just adapted, right? It's just changed. And so it's important to think about, now everything is green, right? Green is the new black, or green is the new green. And so how can we really tell the difference between when something is truly green, or whether it's just greenwashing, whether people are using it for marketing, or whether it's green tech solutions. And so looking at our permaculture ethics, earth care, people care, and fair share as a way to really have what I like to call a moral compass, right? So when we're looking at something, it's not just, or is it all organic, right? It's not just that. We're not just looking at the earth care. Right? We're actually looking at how are the workers treated on the farm? Do they have ownership? Do they have a say in their working conditions? And what do they do with surplus? How is any kind of surplus used to both benefit earth care and people care, or actually used to create more enterprises that are following the ethics? And so we have this great moral compass in permaculture design to really question these new green thinking. So economic systems is what David really came back to. How can we actually tweak economic systems to facilitate this change happening? And what he also reflected on is when they first thought about permaculture design, they were creating it was in the late 1970s during the first oil crisis, a lot of people doing this kind of thinking around the world. And when they first put together permaculture design, it was this way of perennial agriculture. And it has become so much more than that. What they didn't really realize is that if you are practicing permaculture design, you are actually changing our economic system. Because what starts to happen when we start to produce our own food, some of our own medicine, when we start to produce some of our energy decentralized, we're actually taking away from the infrastructure that created the pit of despair, right? So as we're actually practicing this and putting this into play, we're creating a new economy. We're creating a whole new way of interacting in relationship with one another. So if we were to look at kind of a site analysis, right? Permaculture design is all about knowing your site and then understanding that and crafting solutions that are site-specific. What if we did a site analysis on our current economy? So let's just look at a few of these examples, site analysis on our current economic system. This one really struck me. So if we're looking at homelessness in this country, and again, the backdrop of this, richest country in the world, there's actually 22 empty homes for every homeless person. 22 empty homes. We're looking at 842,000 homeless in any given week. Another one that really struck me. So in the richest country in the world, we've got 49 million in poverty. 49 million people in poverty. And then we've got 97 million near poor. Maybe they're living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have any kind of economic security. So if we put that together, that's 146 million people, half of the US population is living in these conditions in the richest country in the world. So is our economic system working? What do you all think? It's working for some people, right? But not for most of us. So if we look at who's it working for, if we look at the percentage of millionaires, right? So 1% of people in the United States are millionaires. And if we kind of zoom in, well, who are those people? If we look at that 1%, we've got 50% of Congress are in that 1% of millionaires. So anybody see any patterns here? What does that mean about our current social and economic system when we have 50% of our decision makers being millionaires? What does that mean? So what? Money's ruling the decisions.
Fair share.
It's not fair share, yeah. What's that?
Poor people don't have as much representation.
As much representation, yeah, all these. The one that strikes out for me is they're not really invested in having anything change, right? You know, maybe on the surface they're benefiting. Surfacely, they're benefiting from this. So I won't go too much more into this, but I wanted to give you a snapshot. If you want to check this out, it's on liberationnews.org. I also have it on my Facebook page. Okay, let's start thinking about what makes our current economic system, right? In permaculture design, we say, well, let's spend 20% of our time really fleshing out the problem so that when we do spend 80% of our energy on the positive solution side, we actually know what we're dealing with and we can craft better solutions to those problems. So 20%, this is our 20% on our current economic system. One of the tenets is private rather than common ownership of the means of production. So when we're talking about the means of production, what does that even mean? Let's break this down a little bit. What's the means of production? Factories. Land. Yeah, land. Water. Intellectual property. Wages. That's kind of a lot of stuff that's under private ownership. And so what? Why could that be potentially harmful, private ownership? So what? They own all the land, the factories, the energy. They can set the price. Yeah, they can set the price. Yeah. So what? They can set the price. Is that it? Yeah, they're maybe out of touch with the rest of the community, isolated. Yeah, and when we're thinking about this, I mean, it's really fundamentally going against this idea of democracy, right, that our country was founded on. We're not sitting at those tables, right? And so they're not only are they setting the price, but they're actually defining the terms at which these goods are manufactured or grown. We don't really have a say in any of that process. We're not sitting at those tables. So one of the other tenets is maximize profit. When you look at a lot of our current corporations, it's actually written into the charter, right? We want to maximize our profit. So what about that? Yes. Yeah, so it forces us into such an economic pattern where it's a growth, exponential growth. Anything else that you can think of that has just exponential growth? What is it? Population. Yeah, and I'm thinking of cancer, right? If we were to compare our economic system to something that we see occurring, I said cancer cells multiplying. You know, so on some level, our economic system is almost like a cancer on the people on the planet. So, yeah, maximizing profit. So oftentimes what happens when we're maximizing profit is ecological regulations. Anything that's getting into, in the way of a company making profit gets thrown out the door. So we're looking at ecological or even union labor or fair wages. All are at the expense. You know, we can't do that. We're going to move our company to Mexico. So what we've seen a lot is this idea, you know, in globalization, we've seen a lot of people's livelihood, these same factories that helped build up communities during the Industrial Revolutions are actually going to different countries. Because in this economic system, they've got to maximize their profit, and that means cutting down on environmental regulations, going to places where they don't have to pay to pollute, and where they don't have to pay workers as much. So we're seeing a lot of this migration of once was the identity of a lot of towns, especially here in New England. A lot of these mill towns are losing their identities as well as their jobs because of maximizing profit and private rather than common ownership over the means of production. Third one we're looking at is wage labor. And to recognize this, I'm drawing this as kind of a list, But this is actually a system, right? We could create this very same list, but in the form of a mind map. So we can actually say, well, private ownership fits into maximizing profit this way, and wage labor actually links back to private ownership because we've got wage labor, meaning that we don't really get to set our own wages. A lot of times our wage is, okay, this is your job, you're going to be making $10 an hour, right? The wage is just handed to you. You don't really have a say. Maybe if you do have a say, you'll just get fired, and they'll just hire the next person that's willing to work for that wage, right? So we have very little control in a lot of our business models over how much we get paid. Next one is goods for sale, not for use. What does that mean?
Is that like
Appearance
appearance over quality?
over quality?
Because if an item works for a while, they're not gonna, business won't grow because they won't have more customers.
Which is connected to planned obsolescence.
Planned obsolescence, yeah. So you guys watch The Story of Stuff and thinking about goods are actually designed to expire. They have like your cell phone lasts for 3 years and then it just breaks and you have to buy a new one. Yeah, so we're not actually creating stuff for use. Like if we all got together in the room and we're like, what do we need as Greenfield Community College permaculture class and friends? You know, what are some of our needs? You might say, well, you know, I really like milk and making like fruit smoothies. So I want blueberries and I want raw dairy milk, right? So we can actually say, and this is what I'm going to use and this is how much I would use. So when you've got goods produced not for actual use, but just for sale, you've got all kinds of things come up. Like Aber was saying, you've got this idea of planned obsolescence because we're actually looking at maximizing profit. And so things have to die in order to have people buy it again and maximize the profit. We're looking at things like this idea of the advertising industry. So we're looking at the advent of the advertising industry, right? We're making goods that people don't actually need, or they don't even maybe want them. So we're actually having to manufacture this idea of you need this, right? The whole advertising industry, which goes on to waste and all those other things. So the last one I want to put in is market. That everything is kind of governed and decided by the market. Right? I remember sitting in econ class in undergrad, and this idea of the invisible hand theory of economics, right? Everything just kind of sorts its way out. And so really thinking, how do we actually, how would we redesign our economic system? If we're looking at ANA on currently how things are going, what is it that we actually want to see in its place? And I would argue that we can flip around these tenets of our current economic system to actually create some tenets of maybe what we would like to see. So let's look at that for a second. Private then, rather than common ownership of the means of production. How might we flip this around? Right, may be a tenet in design of the new economy. Co-ops? Yeah.
Worker-owned.
Yeah, worker-owned models of development. Yeah, so we're saying, how do we have some kind of common ownership over the means of production? How can we actually be involved in the day-to-day decision-making of how we actually get all of our food, energy, housing? How can we have a place at the table so we can decide more ethically responsible ways of creating that? So yeah, we've already got examples of this. Lots of co-ops. We've got land trusts that are actually buying land and holding it in common. There's actually community-owned forests were a huge thing, where an actual town owned a forest, and that was a resource for the community. So we could have coppiced, commonly owned forest lots, right, where we're coppicing firewood and providing small diameter firewood to heat our homes that's governed by the community. Or we could have commonly owned medicinal forests where we're producing some of the medicine in that commonly owned forest. So really just thinking about how can we have a say in the means of our life, right? These are things that we need on a daily basis to live. How do we have a say over that? That's such a radical thing to say, but if you think of it, it's totally ridiculous that we don't. We might have little micro ways that we're doing that now. Maximizing profit, right? So what might be another ethic that we'd want to throw into a new business or a new kind of thinking around an economy?
Should be shared as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so a co-op model, fair share, how are people actually, the goal isn't just to make as much profit as you can, or maybe that's the goal. Maybe you're saying, I want to make as much profit as I can, but then I'm going to have a fair share element of that. That in this profit, we're going to get to decide as a co-op that we want to start your new business idea, that we're going to give you a $5,000 interest-free loan to help you start your ethically wildcrafted microbrew that filters all of its waste through a biodigester and then uses that to run the heat of the building, right? So we're talking about, what if we had a different bottom line than just maximizing profit? Wage labor, same thing. You know, what if I was a part of a worker on co-op pedal people? We actually, if we wanted a raise, we could bring it up in a meeting. It was a crazy idea. We want a raise. So because we had access to the books, we could actually look down and say, okay, well, how much are we bringing in? Can we do this? How would that be with the business? But we decide together. You know, it's a way to decide together. And I hauled trash for 7 years. On my bicycle, 400 pounds of trash, several times a day for 7 years. And part of, you know, one of the reasons why I love doing that is because I actually had a say in the business. I felt like I had a say over my working conditions. And that was thrilling, right? Because even from when we're really small, right, we go to school, and we have to listen to the teachers, and we have bells that we have to correspond to moving classes. And we get out, and we have bosses that we listen to. So we're not really taught to think on our own, to think about, you know, what we want and to tap into that intellectual power that we're all a part of. Because if you look at our current economic system, guess what? That's actually pretty new. It's only been in existence for maybe the last 500 years. If we were to take a yardstick out and we'll say, well, let's trace all of human history, right? Let's look at all of time, right, from the creation of Homo sapiens. How did we live when we're looking at some of those early graphs before 10,000 years ago even? And there's a great work done by social ecologists where they actually study indigenous cultures all over the world, and not to romanticize that, because certainly there was terrible things going on that we wouldn't want to replicate, but what they did find is that in most of those cultures, the idea of hoarding wealth or any goods was actually seen as very antisocial. And so by being a part of that community, you were realized that you were interdependent on each other and the environment. And so the idea of hoarding things like we're seeing here is totally antisocial and not a positive attribute. So in our DNA and our cultural memory, much like the patterns in our palms and in our fists, we actually have a longer memory of a cooperative way of doing things. We actually hold those traits of cooperation. We have that inside of us. So this is a new thing, right? So how do we kind of get back to some of those roots? I know you all talked a little bit about solidarity economy and some examples of this, but I'd like to just draw it in this format. We've got an iceberg up here. And what's one thing about an iceberg? What do we see? What can we say about the iceberg? Where's most of its mass? Yeah, the tip of the iceberg, remember that saying? It actually means something. We see when we're looking at an iceberg that this thing that we can actually visibly see floating above the ocean is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of its mass is underneath the ocean. So let's use this as a metaphor for the new economy, right? When we're looking at what we think of the economy, see of the economy is up here, right? It's just wage labor, you know, exchanging things for the dollar bill. But we have had a lot of interactions that don't involve money. So let's just brainstorm a couple of those. I know you talked about it in class. What are some examples of the new economy that don't involve money that you've been a part of or heard about? You can just kind of popcorn them out. Gift economy. Food sharing. Yeah, bartering. Time trade. We actually have CSAs, right? Community-supported agriculture, where you're all being a member and supporting this. I've got friends that have done community-supported authorship, where they wanted to write a book, but they actually needed money to be able to write the book. And so they said, they did campaigns, and they say, hey, everybody give me $50, and I'll have some money so I can actually have time to write the book, and then you'll get the book when I'm done. right? So there's all different ways that we can do these types of modeling. Something else I want to throw into the time trade aspect is, some of you have heard of Valley Time Trade. This is a really cool way that they've actually taken the idea of time trade and used a platform around it, and they've developed some sophisticated ways. And so let's say we were all a member of the time trade. One of my hours would be equal to one of your hours. So it does a great way of kind of equalizing the playing field, recognizing that we all don't come into this world with the same amount of access to resources or resources in themselves. So we actually can level that playing field. And say I'm a trash picker-upper, and I'll come get your trash, and an hour of my time will be equal to the hour of your time in legal fees that are helping me organize my business into a co-op. So an hour is in an hour, equalized playing field. Yeah, so we have a lot of these examples of a new economy. And what one of my mentors, Julie Graham, says is that the new economy already exists, right? It's already happening. There are people that are developing new business models, entrepreneur ventures, worker co-ops. So this is actually existing. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. We're already playing around with that. So if we were to think for just a moment, you've heard about the idea of ecosystem services, right? When we're planning these ecological systems, they've got functions. Maybe they're storing carbon, or they're collecting rainwater, or they're providing food, or medicine, or habitat. What if we were to think about social, I wanted to use the term social services, but then that's got a different connotation, so maybe we can think of a new way of saying it. But if we were to say, what are indicators of good social health? That if we started some of these ventures or businesses or this idea of a new economy, how would we know if we were doing a good job? So for a second, if you could just turn to somebody next to you, and I'll throw that question. Can you come up with some indicators of good social practice? How would we know if we were doing a good job? What would be happening in our communities, socially? We know our projects, our businesses, our lives, insert thing here, is working when, what do we get? There's less homelessness. Great. What else?
People would actually have to interact with other people.
People interact with other people. Wow, okay. Yeah, people want to interact. Yeah, what else?
Nobody missing out on basic needs like food, water, health, shelter.
Yeah, basic needs are met for everybody. Equality.
Social functions,
Public social functions. What do you mean by that?
like a farmer's market or something,
Yeah,
community functions.
yeah, great.
I want to modify that one. Brett said something really good, which is like spontaneous or spurious community social functions. They're not
Ooh.
even planned or on the calendar.
But it's not on the calendar for 3 weeks? Okay, spontaneous social interactions. Great.
A sense of safety,
Yeah.
feeling safe to be outside and be social and interact.
Yeah. Anything else?
I would say honoring cooperation and including contributions not limited to cash.
Great. What else?
Some reduction of people on pharmaceutical drugs,
Yep.
and that could go to also include coffee or alcohol.
Yeah, we could maybe even say just healthy people.
No, don't take away my coffee.
Don't take away my coffee. Great. Wow, you guys know what you want. That's an excellent sign. Was it easy to come up with these things? Have you ever been asked this question before? By Abra. Great. Excellent. Yeah, so what happens, in this new kind of economy, this new society? How do we know when it's working? And how do we actually have a social lens, right? If we're thinking about social permaculture, how can we actually take maybe even some of our principles, and think about it in a social context. So I'm just going to throw a couple out. Edge effect. We typically think about this in permaculture. The edge is where the action is, right? Maybe we're planting along contour, or maybe we're really looking at mimicking where the sea comes with the forest and all the diversity that that brings. The edge is where the action is. What would that look like in a social setting? How would we apply that principle of permaculture if we're doing a social permaculture design? One of the ways I like to apply this is through coalition building. We don't need to do all of the work by ourselves, right? If we're doing smart permaculture design, we want to do less work. What is the least amount of change that I can do for the greatest effect? Another principle linked to this. And so how can we actually just team up with people that are working on that might have common values? So if you're doing, and all have done that here at Greenfield Community College, how do you actually tap into curriculum development? How do you work with people in the science department to match their need for outdoor classrooms and research facilities with your need for healthy food, right? So we're constantly looking for examples of coalition building that will strengthen the view of the overall project. So the latest conference of Pioneer Valley Grows, they're looking at how can we do equity for workers in the food system? So when we're thinking about our local food system, how do we actually have equity for the restaurant workers, for the food growers, and how can we kind of weave that in to the conversation around local food? So now they're making all kinds of coalitions with union workers, with immigration rights activists, right? So we have a whole new set of partners that we can work with that will just strengthen our project. So whenever we're doing this, how can we use edge effect or least change for greatest effect in that? Another one I like is the problem is the solution. How would we apply that principle socially? I think one of the groups that I really am inspired by that has exemplified this principle is Worcester Roots out in Worcester, Mass. So they have this group called the Toxic Soil Busters, where they were looking at some of the problems of their community is they had high food desert. There wasn't really many places to get good food. And so what they did is they created a group called the Toxic Soil Busters that was run by youth, primarily youth of color, as a worker co-op. And what they did is they drove around their community in Worcester and they tested soil for lead contamination. And then they helped either remediate that soil with plants or build their customers raised beds that they could then grow and eat vegetables out of. So they're solving all those problems. Healthy food, jobs, empowerment, cleaning soil, all by doing great social analysis and applying this principle to their project. I'll do one more. Let's look at on-site resources. Typically, we'll think, okay, great, on-site resources. We've got, these plants, what you all did with the Juneberry plants. You've got existing plants on campus. How can you bring those in? How do you use chip up some wood that's lying around? How can we apply that socially, on-site resources socially? And a lot of that is done. There's great projects called asset mapping. Maybe you've talked about this in class. So this is another model of economic development, especially when you're looking at low-income communities, communities with high unemployment rates, is how do we actually not look for this idea of a savior mentality when okay, great, we just need to attract those tourists. If we can just bring the tourists to Greenfield and then they'll eat at our restaurants and they'll shop in our stores, Greenfield's economy will be great. How do we not do that? How do we say, what are Greenfield's assets, right? Looking at a lot of the farmland that you have close access to, looking at the co-op, looking at the bottling facility and the community kitchen. So you're saying, here's our assets in Greenfield, and how can we actually activate those assets and empower people that are in the community to bring about a change in unemployment rates, right? So you're not looking for that savior, because when that's set up, it's a fragile system. So we want a resilient system. And how do you build businesses that will stay here in Greenfield, that are paying people a fair wage, and that are playing off the existing assets of the community? So any of our principles, we could go through, and I've written an article about this that you can find on my website, where I've taken 10 principles and looked at them socially, how we apply that socially. So I just invite you all to think about those principles through that lens. when you're doing design. I wanted to just show a case study of some work I've been particularly excited about doing, the idea of a permablitz. So I like to frame the permablitz is it's like a flash mob, only tastier, right? So it's a way where you totally transform a site through a lot of organizing and human labor and install what you want. So I'll flash a couple pictures. You all have seen this lot before, right? This is the Paradise lot down in Holyoke. So looking at what it looked like before. A few permablitzes later, that, right? And so when we're talking about ways to visualize what we want, we actually can build the alternatives that we want to see. So Joanna Macy is another mentor. She has the work called The Great Turning, in which she says that there's 3 different types of actions that we can be engaging with during this time of transition, right? Because she's saying, she's like 80 years old. She's saying, I know that change is happening. I remember when she was a young activist, she's like, so much is happening now, the change is coming. And she says there's 3 different things that we can do. We can do holding actions, and those might be things like having soup kitchens, so people do get fed in the interim before we have a community that's entirely fed. Or we do things like a policy work, or we do things like direct action. These important actions that are just even stopping. It's like almost like we're hemorrhaging, and it's just tying it off and stopping the bleeding. How do we do these holding actions? But then simultaneously, how do we actually do some visioning work? How do we actually show what we want in the place of those old systems? And this is where permaculture design actually comes into play. So it's how do we mitigate the harm reduction model? How do we actually create what we do want to see? And then the third thing is how do we create, even more importantly, a shift in consciousness, right? So how do we actually shift the idea of a paradigm from something that's hierarchical or separate from nature to one that's actually interconnected to one. So a permablitz is a great way that we can actually show that. We're bringing people together and we're transforming landscapes. This is one we've done in Northampton, Mass, where we're looking at most of Northampton's food, and it was going from out of town. So Northampton has some of the best farmland soil in the world. 90% of the food grown there was going off to export in the form of like Frito-Lay's chips and feedlot corn. How to reverse those numbers. So we created a project that was called the Montview Neighborhood Farm. It was entirely human-powered because we didn't want to be linked to fossil fuel industry of farming. We said, what if we showed an example of no-till farming that was based on human power and not fossil fuel? What would that look like? So through a series of permablitzes and through 7 years, we transformed this field into this, to a thriving farm. It was feeding 21 members of the community right there. They could walk or bike to the farm and demonstrating a lot of these permaculture principles. And there's one thing that you really can notice when you shift through these, and it speaks to your point about interaction. What do you notice? What's a theme between the before and after pictures? People, right? So we're actually, doing this actually engages people, right? It brings people back into nature. It has people interacting and actually becoming a part of reshaping their community. How are we agents for change, empowered agents for change? It's people interacting and together again. So yeah, just some of the exciting examples that we can do to demonstrate this. This is just a project. So you all got some of the plants from Montview Neighborhood Farm. And so we wanted to actually graphically depict this idea of the spread of change, right? How this change is happening. How can we actually visually show that? And so we created, when the farm was actually closing down. And so after 7 years, the farm came to an end. And on some, a current way of thinking about that, if something doesn't last forever, it's a failure, right? We want something to just last forever. But how do we actually rethink that? And there's an idea I've been floating out called, how are permaculturalists pioneer species? So when we're looking at ecological systems, we've got the scruffy plants like the dandelion or chicory that are they can survive on terrible soil, almost no water, no nutrients, but they're popping up, and what they're doing is they're setting the conditions for succession, right? They're improving the soil, they're bringing up nutrients, they're fixing nitrogen, and they're fixing the soil so that we can get things in later succession. We can get elderberries and raspberries and things in later succession. How are permaculture designers, how are we setting the stage for social succession? And so how can we do demonstration projects when we can recognize that there's a need in our community that's not being met? And how can we actually activate that? When we first started the farming project in Northampton, there was no in-town farms at all. This is in 2004. Now there's 2. And there's 2 giant CSAs that are fulfilling some of that need. So how can we act as pioneer species and pop up? How do we actually visualize change? This is a map we created where we had an event called the Montview Diaspora. And we invited people to come, and it was a plant swap. It was a big plant swap. And then we gave away a lot of our plants. And so you could come through, we called it Build Your Own Polyculture Bar. So you could come through, you can grab a Josta berry, a dwarf, a comfrey, you could build your own polycultures. And then you take a photo with your plants, and we'd add you to the map. So we wanted a way to visually represent this spreading of ideas and the way that the local food and permaculture movements have taken off. So this is one graphic that was created that showed where did these plants go, what lives will they have, how are these ideas spreading, and how can we actually show that visually. And then looking at all of the social connections, the community connections that are happening in between these before and after pictures, right? There's a lot of work that happens in between that. And how is that work actually strengthening our bonds, building our communities, and then for increasing our resiliency? Because if we're thinking about true security, you know, I like the phrase homestead security, right? Or if we're thinking about retirement, you know, all of these issues, it really comes down to our relationships to one another. So that's another yield. In permaculture, we talk about the yield is theoretically unlimited. When we're doing and engaging in this community work, we're building relationships, we're building our sense of security and belonging, and we're reknitting this idea of a culture. Because much like when my family, what they had in Italy, kind of, how can we rebuild that there, here, where we are? We're all kind of transplanted from somewhere or another. We've got shallow roots. How can we start to deepen them through these kinds of activities and through rebuilding an ecological culture? David Holmgren said that that's really what this is about. This is about a total paradigm shift, and it's about recreating a regenerative culture that's based around the ethics of permaculture. So kind of going from that to this. So thanks so much for being here. Passing around Mobile Design Lab my card. Feel free to keep in touch with me. Check out some stuff on Facebook and my webpage. And yeah, good luck with all of the projects that you've got going on here. Thank you.